By sunrise on the third day at Thermopylae, Leonidas already knew the battle was lost. A Persian force had marched through the night along a mountain path and was now coming down behind the Greek position. The narrow pass that had protected the defenders for 2 days was about to become a trap. Leonidas still had time to leave. Instead, according to Herodotus, he sent many of the allied troops away and remained with his Spartans, 700 Thespians, a Theban contingent, and others who would not escape the final fighting. That is the moment everyone remembers. 300 Spartans against the Persian Empire, a king choosing death. One last stand. But the popular version makes the story simpler than it really was. The 300 were never the only Greeks at Thermopylae. They were probably not sent there on a suicide mission. Leonidas did not defeat Xerxes, and the battle did not save Greece by itself. Strip away those myths, and Leonidas becomes less superhuman. He also becomes more interesting. Because what made his final decision remarkable was not that he believed he could perform a miracle. It was that he understood what the position could still achieve when the miracle was gone. Leonidas had not even been expected to become king. He belonged to one of Sparta's 2 royal houses. Sparta had 2 kings at the same time, alongside powerful magistrates called ephors and other political institutions. A Spartan king was important, especially in war, but he was not an absolute monarch. Leonidas had older brothers. One of them, Cleomenes, became king. Another, Dorias, died abroad. When Cleomenes died without a surviving son, the throne eventually came to Leonidas, who had also married Cleomenes' daughter Gorgo. By 480 BC, Persia was preparing one of the largest military expeditions the Greek world had ever seen. King Xerxes wanted to complete the conquest his father Darius had failed to achieve 10 years earlier at Marathon. The Persian Empire was not a primitive horde. It was the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen, with roads, taxation, provincial administration, fleets, engineers, cavalry, archers, and troops drawn from many different peoples. Ancient writers gave Xerxes impossible numbers by modern standards. We do not know the exact size of his invasion force. What matters is simpler. The Greeks facing him were badly outnumbered, and they were divided. Before we continue, my name is Noah. We built this channel for people who want the real story behind history's most legendary figures, not just the version movies left us. If that sounds like you, subscribe. It is free and it helps us make better videos more than you might think. All right, back to Sparta. Many Greek cities submitted to Persia. Others formed an alliance led on land largely by Sparta and at sea by Athens and its partners. Their plan depended on geography. A Greek army would block the narrow route at Thermopylae, while the Allied fleet operated nearby at Artemisium. If the Persian army could not pass Thermopylae, and the Persian fleet could not safely move past Artemisium, the invasion would be forced into a bottleneck. Leonidas was chosen to command the force at the pass. And this is where another detail matters. Herodotus says the 300 Spartans with Leonidas were men who had living sons. That does not prove Leonidas selected them, because he knew they would all die. But it does tell us that the men at the center of the story were not random volunteers. They were selected from a very specific military elite, and their families would continue if they did not return. Here is the part almost every movie gets wrong. Spartan military reputation was built through an unusually demanding citizen culture, but it came with a darker foundation. Full Spartan citizens could devote themselves to warfare partly because a much larger population of helots worked the land under coercion. Sparta's famous discipline did not exist in a vacuum. It depended on a deeply unequal society at home. And even that military system did not send only 300 men to stop Persia. The 300 were not the only Greek soldiers at Thermopylae. They probably were not sent there simply to die. Herodotus lists several thousand allied troops at the pass, including Arcadians, Corinthians, Phocians, Locrians, 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and others. The Spartans themselves were an advance force. The festival of the Carnea was taking place at Sparta, while the Olympic festival also affected the wider Greek mobilization. Herodotus says larger forces were expected to follow. In other words, Leonidas was not leading 300 men into a planned theatrical death. He was holding an advanced defensive position while more help was supposed to come. The problem was that Xerxes arrived before the Greek response could fully develop. At first, some of the defenders wanted to abandon Thermopylae, and retreat south. Leonidas argued for staying and sending messages for reinforcements. That decision made sense because the pass was one of the few places where Greek heavy infantry could reduce Persia's advantage in numbers. In 480 BC, the coastline ran much closer to the mountains than it does today. The road narrowed between steep ground and the sea. The Greeks also repaired an old defensive wall. Persian troops could not simply deploy their entire army at once. They had to attack through restricted space. When Xerxes finally ordered the assault, the geography did exactly what the Greeks hoped. The Medes and Scythians attacked and failed to break the line. Then Xerxes committed the elite troops Greek sources called the Immortals. They failed too. Herodotus describes the Greek contingents rotating through the fighting. He also describes Spartans using controlled retreats, turning suddenly when Persian troops pursued them. Whether every tactical detail happened exactly as he tells it, the larger result is clear. For 2 days, frontal attacks did not solve the problem. The Persian army was enormous. Thermopylae would not let it fight like an enormous army. And this is the real reason Leonidas mattered before the final stand. He did not need his men to be superhuman. He needed them to remain organized in exactly the place where organization mattered more than numbers. For 2 days it worked. The Greek advantage was also physical. Hoplites fought behind large shields with long thrusting spears, and the narrow ground limited the Persian ability to surround them. Persian archery could wound and exhaust, but arrows alone could not easily clear a defended passage while fresh Greek contingents rotated into the line. This did not make the Greeks invulnerable. It made the Persian army solve the wrong problem again and again: how to force more men through a space that only allowed a limited number to fight. Then one man changed the geometry of the battle. Ephialtes, a local man, told the Persians about a path over the mountains that could bring troops behind the Greek position. The path was not completely unguarded. Leonidas had placed roughly 1,000 Phocians there. But during the night, Persian troops under Hydarnes climbed the route. The Phocians were surprised, moved higher on the mountain expecting an attack, and the Persians continued past them towards the rear of Thermopylae. For 2 days, Xerxes had tried to solve Leonidas from the front. Now he did not have to. At dawn, the Greeks learned they were being surrounded. This is the 50% pivot in the real story. Thermopylae was no longer a defensible bottleneck. It was a closing trap. The defenders held a council. Herodotus gives us more than one possible interpretation of what happened next. He says some allies wanted to leave, while Leonidas may also have ordered men away to save them. He adds another explanation. Before the invasion, the Spartans had received an oracle saying that either Sparta would be destroyed or a Spartan king would die. Herodotus believed Leonidas may have remembered that prophecy. We cannot enter Leonidas's mind. Duty, religion, military necessity, honor, and the need to protect a retreat may all have mattered. What we do know is that many allies left. Leonidas did not, and neither did everyone who stayed with him belong to Sparta. The 700 Thespians are the great forgotten soldiers of Thermopylae. Herodotus says they remained willingly and died with the Spartans. They had no global reputation for producing invincible warriors. They did not have a Hollywood movie built around their city. They stayed anyway. The Theban contingent is more complicated. Herodotus claims Leonidas kept them against their will because he distrusted their loyalty and that many later surrendered. Modern historians have debated how much confidence we should place in that hostile account. So the famous last stand was not 300 Spartans standing alone. It was a mixed final force whose motives were not all identical. That makes the story messier. It also makes it more human. And it changes what Leonidas's decision means. He was not choosing between certain victory and heroic death. He was choosing between retreat from a position he had publicly committed Sparta to defend and a final action whose military value was limited but real. Remaining could help cover the withdrawal of allies, impose additional losses, and demonstrate that the alliance had not simply collapsed at the first successful Persian maneuver. How much each motive mattered is impossible to measure. When the last battle began, Leonidas no longer fought the way he had on the first 2 days. According to Herodotus, the Greeks advanced farther into the wider part of the pass. They knew the flanking force was approaching. There was little reason left to conserve themselves. Spears broke. The fighting moved to swords, and Leonidas was killed. But that was not the end of the battle. Herodotus describes a savage struggle around the king's body. The Persians and Spartans fought over it, and the Greeks drove their opponents back several times before recovering Leonidas. Think about what that means. Leonidas was already dead, and his men were still fighting for him. Then the Persian force from the mountain arrived. The surviving Greeks withdrew towards a small hill behind the old wall. Their formation collapsed under attacks from multiple directions. Missiles overwhelmed the remaining defenders. The Thespians died there with the Spartans. The pass was open. Xerxes had won Thermopylae, and afterwards, according to Herodotus, he treated Leonidas's body with unusual hostility, ordering it mutilated and displayed. That detail tells us something about how the ancient story itself wanted Leonidas remembered. Not as the man who defeated Persia, as the enemy who had made the Persian king angry enough to punish him after death. But we should not turn the defeat into a secret victory. Thermopylae fell. The Allied fleet at Artemisium withdrew when the land position was lost. The Persian army moved south. Athens was evacuated and later occupied and burned. The war was not decided at the hot gates. The decisive reversal came later. At Salamis, the Greek fleet defeated the Persians in narrow waters. The following year, a Greek army won at Plataea. Thermopylae mattered most powerfully as memory. Greek communities could point to the battle as proof that Persian numbers were not automatically decisive. Sparta could use the sacrifice to reinforce its claim to leadership. Later writers transformed the last stand into a moral example about obedience, courage, and freedom. That memory became far larger than the few days the battle actually delayed Xerxes. So Leonidas did not save Greece alone. He did not stop Xerxes permanently. He did not command only 300 men. And he was not leading a group of supernatural warriors who could ignore numbers, fatigue, or death. That is the legend. A myth needs heroes who cannot feel fear, cannot miscalculate, and cannot lose until the story decides they should. History is harsher. Real commanders make choices without knowing how later generations will judge them. Leonidas did not know that poets, historians, painters, and filmmakers would turn his death into one of antiquity's most famous scenes. The history gives us something different. A king who had not expected to become king. A commander leading an advance force that expected reinforcements. A defensive plan that used terrain intelligently. A coalition of Greeks from cities that often distrusted one another. 2 days in which discipline and geography held back a much larger force, then a flanking movement that made the position impossible. And finally, a decision to remain when escape was still available. We cannot prove that Leonidas stayed for one single heroic reason. Maybe he believed Spartan law demanded it. Maybe he believed the oracle. Maybe he wanted to cover the withdrawal. Maybe leaving after choosing Thermopylae would have destroyed the reputation Sparta relied on to lead the alliance. Most likely, several of those things mattered at once. And that is exactly why the real Leonidas is more impressive than the fictional one. The fictional Leonidas knows he is a hero because the story has already decided it. The historical Leonidas had incomplete information, limited forces, allies with different interests, and an enemy he could not defeat permanently. When the position could still be defended, he held it. When it could not, many others were allowed to leave. And when his own escape was still possible, he stayed. Leonidas did not win Thermopylae. He made losing impossible to forget. The legend made him larger than life. The history makes his choice matter.